Anyway, what I'm going to do, because the theme is world tensions futures, or as we've all been saying to ourselves, something else, WTF, I was starting to think about what some of the attractors are for affect studies. So where are some of the debates coalescing and intensifying, and how might we think about future directions in terms of affect theories? And I've been particularly interested in the trend to go to the sciences to furnish our accounts of affect, whether that's the cognitive sciences, neurosciences, psychological sciences, the life and biological sciences, quantum physics. So this is a trend that's been identified. It's obviously also a trend around which there's various critique and counter-critique. So I'm also interested in this because I have a training in science. I actually studied psychology and then left the discipline promptly because I was very disenchanted with the positivism. But I retained an interest in experiences that have largely been disqualified by psychology. So they tend to appear as abnormal perceptions, signs of psychopathology, sometimes as curious anomalies and puzzles that hopefully, and this is the narrative that psychology tells, one day it will be able to explain. This includes voice hearing, but also a whole range of experiences that appear under the designation of the subliminal, the automatic, the non-conscious. So experiences that have very much been a focus within affect study or affect studies. So this really provides my entry point into the field of affect studies. So I'm interested then in this trend to go to the sciences, and we're all aware of the critique and counter-critique, I think. Some of it was played out within the pages of the journal Critical Inquiry with Ruth Lee's interventions, and then the various responses to this from Elizabeth Wilson, Adam Franks, William Connolly, and others. And other people have made similar critiques. Margaret Wetherell, a paper by Callard, Papulius and Callard in a special issue of Body and Society that we did on affect. But I don't really like the combative nature of some of this discussion, and I guess I want to come at it more sideways. That's how I'm thinking of it. So my proposition to you today, and it's very much a proposition, is that there is something very interesting in science, but I'm not particularly interested in what I call legitimate science. That is science that has already achieved the status of truth or veridicality, to use a term that Foucault uses. I've always, as I've said, been interested in what gets disqualified from the so-called proper archives, particularly of psychology. So I'm going to, and I've been reading around this in relation to the discussions of reparative readings, and I read Heather Love's interesting essay in 2010, and I like the ambivalences she picks up between the reparative and paranoid readings. And I think, like many people, I want to retain a place for critique, but it may be a different kind of critique to the kind of combative nature of this. And my own work has become very attuned to experimentation, pleasure, surprise, misrecognition, near-missed encounters, and fantasies. And Heather might hear some of that because I've actually poached it from her own paper. And so I'm going to explore a proposition for you today that there's something very interesting for us in what's called weird science. So this is illegitimate science, science that becomes disqualified by proper science. It often passes as a science of oddities, exceptions, or anomalies. It's not a term that I've made up. It's actually an established term that scientists use to police the boundaries between the acceptable and the non-acceptable. And this is all, I've realized this has always been my interest, and I can go into to reasons why this is later if you're interested. So that's my proposition, that as affect theorists, I think there's something really interesting about this archive of weird science. And indeed, I would go as far as to say that weird science might be considered almost the illegitimate daughter of affect studies, or the naughty cousin. And given, I think, our interest in experiences which blur distinctions between the self and other, the inside and outside, the natural and the cultural, the human and the technical, perhaps even the past and the present, I've been surprised myself that there isn't more interest in these archives. So I'm going to try and convince you why they're interesting. For those of you that don't know, this image on the right is an image of Lady Wonder, the typing horse. Has anyone heard of her? She was a fairly major celebrity, I think, at Duke University in about 1928 and 29. So there were various experiments done under the tutelage of William McDougall in relation to the Rhines, who set up the first parapsychology lab at Duke. So yes, this is Lady Wonder, the typing horse. So I've become very interested in these marginal characters, these outliers, and I'm particularly interested in how they exist in a kind of submerged, disguised, or displaced form. Okay, so this is my proposition then, and this is now I'm tasked with trying to convince you why weird science is of interest. The talk is rather tongue-in-cheek, but there are serious propositions at the heart of it, so I'd like you to kind of suspend your disbelief. And part of what I'm trying to do is find a way into weird science that refuses the usual dichotomy, which is either you endorse or you remain skeptical. So at the heart of weird science is the proposition that it's possible to believe impossible or improbable things. So that's what I'm going to invite you to consider, that it's possible to believe impossible or improbable things. If you were a scientist, you would develop a cultivated attitude of skepticism, which enables you to police the boundaries between the legitimate and the illegitimate. If you endorse usually this statement, you often end up in the realms of conspiracy theory. So I've ended up reading some very strange stuff, including that President Obama has already been to Mars in the 1980s as part of a NASA expedition. And recently a 600,000-year-old plug was found, an electric plug socket was found in a cave. So, okay. So I have always had, as I said, this interest in weird science, but I did find that some of our, what we might call founding figures of the field of affect study also had an interest in weird science, or at least at the time in experiences which blur these distinctions that I've already referred to, self and other, inside, outside, natural, cultural, human, technical, and so on and so forth. So in my book, Immaterial Bodies, which was really my foray into affect studies through a very particular 19th, early 20th century archive, I was looking at some of particularly the experiments, the practices, the entities, the figures that were part of this archive, who were all experimenting with these kinds of phenomenon, what I call threshold phenomenon. And as I'm sure you'll know, this includes suggestion, includes the experience of automaticity, which is the feeling of being moved by someone or even something else, voice hearing, but also a range of psychic entities, telepathy, mediumship, and so on and so forth. So as I'm sure you'll know, many of our founding figures, many vitalist philosophers were experimenting with psychic entities and phenomenon. So including William James, Henry Bergson, Gabriel Tard, Albert North Whitehead, as well as more minor figures that you might not have heard of, Boris Sidis, Frederick Myers, William McDougall, Edward Ross, Gertrude Stein and Leon Solomon. So I found this lovely photograph of Gertrude Stein and I've forgotten her name, Alice B. Toklas, with their lovely Labradoodle. And this image at the bottom is taken from William James's Harvard psychology lab, where they were experimenting with different phenomena that, again, all blur these kinds of boundaries. Partly what I was interested in with this archive is how, in the context of psychology, a cut was made. So in the 20th century, as psychology professionalized it as a discipline, there was a kind of agential cut made where the psychic, where there was a cut drawn between the psychic and the psychological, and a process through which the proper object of psychology was constituted. And this really, it's this cut between the psychic and the psychological that I've been very interested in and that I explore in the book. And I think there is something at stake in that cut, and that we have actually inherited this in terms of our own affect theories, particularly in relation to the argument that subjectivity is now obsolete or redundant or over. I think actually if we start to look at the complex relationships that were taking place when we bring this cut back together, we can see much more interesting questions that don't presume that subjectivity is over and actually displace the human psychological subject, which has always been at the heart of my own practice. So I can perhaps say a little bit more about that later if you're interested in, but that's what I do in the book. And I do believe there is an argument in the book to be taken seriously, and at least I've become quite convinced of it. So, and anyway, if I hadn't been convinced then, I started a new project, and I found that I was actually back with this cut between the psychic and the psychological again, but this time in relation to two contemporary science controversies that were largely taking place across social media. You probably will know of them because they're very American controversies. They involve American professors. One's called the priming controversy, associated with the work of John Barr. Some of you may have heard of this. But the one I'm going to talk about is associated with Daryl Bem, and it's come to be known as the Feeling the Future controversy. So I'm going to say something about that to you in a minute. But before I do that, I just want to say something about my method and strategy towards science in the context of reparative reading. As I said, I've always been interested in outliers, what becomes disqualified and exists in submerged, disguised, or displaced forms. And latterly, I've become really interested in the work of Hans-Jörg Reinberger, who some of you may know, a philosopher. I think he was trained as a molecular biologist as well. He's quite an interesting scientist to think with because he's actually read Donna Haraway, which I think is quite amazing. So he's quite skeptical himself of the whole narrative of kind of truth and progress within the sciences. And he has quite an interesting neologism, historiality, which really brings together the close entanglement between science and storytelling. So science tells stories. We know this from Donna Haraway. And in this book that I've recently finished, I engage in a kind of storytelling about these two controversies, and particularly about what emerged within the context of PPPR. Do people know what PPPR is? Post-publication peer review. So, yeah. So now it's not enough now to secure a publication, a journal article or a book. Now you have to tweet about it, post on Facebook, but you have to somehow do that without appearing as if you're engaging in self-promotion and personal branding. But I was interested in PPPR in the context of these two controversies because there was lots of data to look at, data produced by scientists who were commenting on each other's work, blogging about it. And in a sense, the kind of data that you get is what exceeds the normal conventions of positivist science writing, so what usually gets edited out. So in this book, I follow this data. I call it haunted data, but I particularly follow what gets rendered nonsensical or ludicrous or marginal. So it's very much about the playful contamination of science through the ludicrous, the strange, and the weird. And I didn't know where I would end up, honestly, but where I did end up was quite amazing, actually, and I think really important, particularly for affect studies. And what I get from Reinberger is his focus on controversies. So he focuses on controversies across time within science, and he looks at what comes back at different moments, even if at some point the controversies are taken to be resolved. And he has this really nice concept of removing. So removing is when you put something back into circulation. So what I'm trying to do in the book is to put the ludicrous back into circulation. And actually, it's a very serious proposition, because actually it takes us to some really interesting places. So very briefly, just to give you a couple of examples of what's got two things that have been rendered weird science that we might want to think with. This is an article that was published in the British Medical Journal in 1997. It's called A Difficult Case, a diagnosis made by hallucinatory voices. This involved a woman who started to hear voices, and the voices told her that she was suffering from a brain tumour. So she took herself off to the doctor, and the doctor diagnosed her with a hallucinatory psychosis. That was his way of reassuring her, no, you haven't got a brain tumour, you're actually crazy. Anyway, the voices persisted, still saying to her, you have a brain tumour. So she said to her psychiatrist, look, these voices will not go away despite the fact you've given me medication that is supposed to lessen the voices. So in order to reassure her further, he said, okay, I'll give you a brain scan. So what do you think was found? Yeah. So she was found to have a brain tumour. The tumour was removed, and then the voices thanked her for listening. And she didn't hear voices again. Now, this article has been circulated for many years, so I've been collaborating with the Hearing Voices Network, some of you may have heard of them, for many, many years. And the idea that a voice can actually communicate something about a person's life has been something that most scientists would not consider. So a serious proposition is that believing the impossible or the improbable is really important. And some of you may know scientists are now taking the Hearing Voices Network very seriously, and I can perhaps say something more about that later. But anyway, this is just some irrelevant stuff. I hate slides, but basically, as I said, this was an anomaly. It was published in the British Medical Journal, and it totally confounded psychiatrists. Another example of weird science might be this contemporary study that was became the subject of a Radio 4 documentary at the end of last year, just before Christmas. Where, as you can see, I think these photographs are fantastic. Someone was put into an MRI scanner, they were hypnotized, and this is a contraption that would enable them to then engage in a form of automatic writing, whereby, if the experiment worked, they might experience their hand moving as if they were being directed by an extrapersonal entity. So anyway, the scanner wasn't on, which is also quite interesting. But they did find that actually they could produce these kinds of experiences of automaticity. But there was a curious anomaly in this work, which was they recognized that cultural beliefs about what it means to enter into suggestive relations were shaping how people experienced automaticity. So that's something also for me really, really important. And sometimes I think we tend to decontextualize or dehistoricize affective processes. So this whole question of what it means to enter into suggestive relations is a historical question, and I think this is a question that we need to heed, and I've been very influenced by Isabel Stengers in relation to this question. So 2 examples then of weird science, that just to show you actually they're not just crazy or the results of mad beliefs of scientists. There's something quite important in this. So very quickly then, I'm not sure how long I've got, so I'll trudge on quickly. This is one of the controversies that I've been removing within the book Haunted Data, and some of you may know this. It relates to Daryl Bem, the Cornell professor, who did a series of experiments which proved within the realms of statistical probability that it's possible not only to feel the future, that is to anticipate the future, but also for the future to retroactively change the past. And he got his inspiration for the experiments from Lewis Carroll through The Looking Glass. So he says, the concept of retroactive facilitation of recall is aligned to the White Queen's view that memory that only works backwards from present to past is a poor memory. As he suggests in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, the White Queen explains to Alice that the citizens of her country have precognitive ability, or as she puts it, memory works both ways in her land, and she herself remembers best things that happen the week after next. When Alice says, I'm sure mine only works one way, I can't remember things before they happen, the Queen disparagingly remarks it's a poor sort of memory that only works backwards. Some of you may know this controversy because it really caught the attention of broadcast media, and Daryl Bem was interviewed on the Colbert Report with the tagline, time-travelling porn. So have people heard of this controversy? Yeah, okay, cool. Right, let me just get my page. So anyway, so this is one of the controversies that I remove in the book. And I'm interested also in the idea of living in an Alice in Wonderland. You may have heard, you may not, but the recent Labour Party leadership election contest in the UK, the socialist candidate and now leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, was described by the former Labour leader and Prime Minister Tony Blair as living in an Alice in Wonderland alternative reality. This was actually a slur or charge on Corbyn and his critics, who've continually accused him of being out of time and importantly stuck in the 1980s. So anyway, it was this figuration of Alice in Wonderland that was an inspiration for Daryl Bem. And he claimed to be engaging in what he called time reversal, that is, reversing known psychological effects. One of them was the half-second delay between stimulus and response that we'll be quite familiar with. And I'm going to come to that a little bit later. So for those of you that don't know anything about Bem, he was an already controversial figure within psychology. We're told he's a gay Cornell professor with an unusual gender non-conforming past. He'd married and had children with Sandra Bem, the late women's studies professor. Now, a pre-publication version of the experiment was published on his website, and this caused a furore, and it created what many people refer to as a buzz or a blather on Bem. And as I said earlier, this was particularly in the context of PPPR, where people were blogging on websites, tweeting, Facebooking. And it was really interesting to me because a lot of what was being enacted was hostility, skepticism, incredulity, rage, all this stuff that usually exceeds the normative conventions of positivist science. As I said, he was invited onto the Colbert Report. There was a media stir and flurry of attention, so he appeared in season 2, episode 5 of the American documentary series Through the Wormhole, presented by Morgan Freeman, in an episode asking, do we have a sixth sense? He was interviewed by ABC, Al Jazeera, Fox News, and a whole range of newspapers, the New York Times, many of the British broadsheets, The Guardian, and so on. So part of what I'm interested in is this whole PPPR as a source of scientific data. So I very much consider it data. And as I said, I'm interested in the haunted data, what gets very quickly submerged and displaced as the proper narrative associated with the controversies emerged, so how it's seen to become resolved. This is just quite interesting, just to show the extent of the reach and traction of this controversy on social media and broadcast media. Bem argued that Dustin Hoffman should play him in the film version of the controversy. So there's some really amusing stuff on here. Okay, so the method in this book, very briefly, is what I call a digital hauntology. It's an affective methodology that's inspired by Karen Barad, Ray Chow, Derrida, Hans-Jörg Reinberger, Avery Gordon, Grace Cho. And I treat this and the other controversy as a scene of entanglement, which not splices and enacts different temporalities. And as I said, I'm working particularly with those, in a sense, links that very quickly become submerged or displaced or deferred. And that's what I follow and remove in the book. And I'm interested in proliferating visibilities and also showing those points of epistemic instability within these controversies, and that's what's most interesting. But it's the points of epistemic instability that would disappear when they're aggregated on social media. So processes of aggregation of data would actually remove this haunted data, so I'm trying to bring it back. Okay. Partly where I end up is in areas that I think would make even Karen Barad's head turn. And so rather than find an image of Karen Barad's head turning, I've actually found a very dapper image of Karen Barad, which I hope will make your head turn. But it's very, very interesting where you end up. I ended up in the realms of quantum consciousness, quantum computing, quantum physics. And a first version of this paper, I was going to attempt to make sense of the controversy for you, and then I had to give up on that. So all I can hope is that I've given you enough to maybe want to read the book. But I'm going to give you some headlines, which I hope might generate some interesting discussion. Am I okay for time?
About 2-3 minutes.
Yeah, 2-3 minutes. Okay, this is going to be... Okay, so partly then, in terms of scientific data, I'm approaching the theories that are being enacted within these controversies as imaginaries, not just as theories. And actually, the idea of feeling the future is part of a set of very potent cultural imaginaries, quantum computing, software, business strategy, practices of speculative forecast and preemption, quantum teleportation, quantum cryptology. These are all practices that attempt to feel the future and work, in a sense, work with conceptions of time where time is bent, distorted, telescoped, turned inside out, upside down. And these imaginaries are very much materialized within different practices, so we might want to take them seriously. There's a really interesting article that's been very heavily cited, so you may know it, by Adams et al. In Subjectivity, that's quite interesting in terms of this idea of anticipation. Okay, and one of the places I ended up, and this is where I'll sort of start to finish, is with Libet and the half-second delay. What was really interesting was actually there was an interpretation that came back that Libet made of his own studies that apparently he was ridiculed for at his time. So apparently this idea of a half-second delay wasn't quite... in a sense, the interpretation he was making. There were some anomalies within this, and he had a very different set of interpretations that have become largely displaced, which came back within this controversy. So, and I'm just going to read this out. So Libet argued in short that it was not that the brain reacts before conscious experience or interpretation, but rather that the future can retroactively influence the past. Or to quote a contemporary neuroscientist, so the first set of findings, 1 to 3, are to the effect that neural adequacy for any sensory experience is achieved only after a certain delay, about half a second. But finding 4, which is indeed crucial, appears to conflict with this. That is, the ordering by subjects of their experiences is this: conscious experience owed to later skin stimulus came before conscious experience owed to earlier cortical stimulus. Now, we're not going to resolve this conundrum, and that's not my point here. But really, this came back to haunt me in a sense, and I became very interested in where this interpretation had migrated to, because it hadn't gone away and it reappears in different contexts. And I can perhaps say more about that afterwards. So I'm going to start to finish now, but so I'm interested in this proposition and what it might mean to experiment when time travel is assumed to be probable or possible. This is a quote from Albert North Whitehead that comes back within the controversy, which I'll perhaps leave up for you to think about. Yeah, I've got far more in this paper, but I can see I don't want to take up any more time. What will I say to finish? What do you want me to say? I don't know if there is anything to say. Perhaps what I will say is one of the things that comes back is if we go, this controversy also connects to some of the earlier archive I was looking at genealogically in immaterial bodies. One of the things that comes back is there were very inventive approaches to experimentation which work with the idea that psychological phenomena are indeterminate, contiguous, entangled, and so on and so forth. And so I've looked particularly at experiments with automatic writing that Gertrude Stein and Leon Solomon's engaged in, that I can perhaps talk about. But this is perhaps the end then, that I think we need to be, if we're going to engage with science, I do think we need to really think through how scientific data is produced and also think about the historicity of affective phenomena. And I think bringing in some of the really important work on critical historiographies of attention, perception, suggestion, Jonathan Crary, Stefan Andriopoulos, and many other people. Grace Cho, Roger Luckhurst, Vinciane Desprez, Emily Martin, Jackie Orr, David Howe, and Steve Brown's work is really important. So yes, I think I'll leave there. Thank you.